Okay, well, welcome back to our deep dive into PMBOK 5. This is Module 10, and now we're going to talk about project communications, and in particular in this module, how we plan for our communications. So, project communication management is all about what? It's about the processes, again, the processes that are required to ensure timely and appropriate, timely is important too, timely and appropriate planning, collection, distribution, storage, retrieval, management of, control of, and monitoring of, and the ultimate disposition of all project information. We communicate information of all sorts, and that's what this is. Plan, collect, distribute, store, retrieve, control, monitor, and dispose of project information. There's a number of communication types you need to know before we get into the ETOs. There could be internal communications, external communications, formal, written, or otherwise documented somehow communications, informal communications, okay, notes to people, vertical, you could go up the food chain, you could go across the food chain, and horizontal, or your staff, or whatever it is, vertical, horizontal. You could have official kinds of communications, where an official would be defined by organization, or even within your project what an official communication is, versus an unofficial communication. It could be written or oral communication, obviously, and verbal and nonverbal. Now these, as it says here, verbal, the way you use your voice to communicate and the way you use your body language. If I'm doing this, da, 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 that means like, holy cow, stop, right? And if I'm saying things like, yeah, that's the way to do it, you say, yeah, that's a good thing, right? So your body, nonverbal, yeah, that kind of thing, or no, 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 or yeah, that's great. They have different inflections. They mean different things to you and your team or whoever you're talking to. So that's your verbal, nonverbal kinds of communication. So you need to keep those in mind. These, are official PMBOK definitions. So you need to keep those in mind as you're going through your project. You need communication skills. We talked about actively listening to your stakeholders for one thing, and observing and listening to your staff, walking the talk, that kind of thing. So listen actively and effectively. Question things, probe ideas. If you hear something, don't let it just go. See if it has any value to you and your team. Listen, probe the ideas. Educate your team. Always keep your team educated and good and motivated. Fact find. Somebody says something, you see something funny. Get the facts before you confront somebody, or before you congratulate somebody on something that they should perhaps not have been congratulated on. In fact, so you need to find the facts before you really act as much as you can. You are the ones who sets and manages expectations in your project. You need to communicate those expectations. Persuasion, again, negotiation, conflict resolution, all that stuff has to do with communication, persuading to perform things. Motivating, a lot of interpersonal skills here, right? Motivating to encourage, coaching to achieve desired results for your team and for your project. Negotiate mutually acceptable agreements. Remember those different kinds of conflict resolution. One of them is just negotiate it out. Try to do that. Negotiating is always best, especially when we talk about procurements. Negotiating is better than going to court on something. So negotiating is the best thing you can do. Then everybody's kind of happy because they've all had an involvement. They've all agreed to whatever the result is. Resolving conflicts to prevent disruptions. Nip it in the bud before it becomes a bad thing, a really bad thing. And then identify and summarize the next steps so people know, or at least are reinforced with what they think they should be doing next in your project. So summarizing the next steps is nice, a good skill to have. So, project communication management, how many processes are there and what are they? There are 3. And we're going to talk about, in this module, planning your communication management, plan how you're going to do it, what guidance you're going to have, and then we're going to manage those communications, and then the result of our managing them, which is an executing process group. We're executing our communications. There's fallout from that, good or bad, and then we need to control that fallout. So those are the 3. Okay, here's our knowledge area process group grid. And here's our project communication knowledge area line. Plan communication management. Where would that fall? Which process group is that? Well, plan, okay? It's a planning process. Manage, we're managing things. Things are happening, we're managing them, so we're executing, right? And now we're going to control the results of our management. Good or bad, or you need to control that, and that is the monitoring and controlling process group. And that's it for the 3 processes. So here's the overview of this knowledge area. We're going to talk about now, as I said, the 10.1 in this module. We'll talk about the other 2 in the next module. But look at what I've covered with the red boxes. These are pretty key. The main input, as we'll see, to planning your communication is your stakeholder. They are, even though it's exceedingly important you communicate properly with your team, it is the stakeholders that you give the highest priority to communicate with them. They need to know what's going on in the proper context for them. So the stakeholder register is a key input here, and the key output down here is your communication management plan, because the stakeholders will tell you how they prefer to have their communications, what the content of their communications, what they don't care to see, and the format that they want to see things in. So that all comes from the stakeholder register and your interviews with stakeholders as you engage them, right, as you manage them, their expectations. And by the way, I don't want to belittle your communication with the project team at all, because they're certainly involved. They're up here under the project management plan, the communication plan that we're doing here. So they're involved in your staff management plan, HR, the whole bit comes in here. So not to belittle them, but the key primary thing is you got to keep your stakeholders happy on board with you, and so they know what's going on in the project. When we get to managing it, the primary input here is, other than the communication plan on how we're going to do these things, it's the work performance reports, which is the final incarnation of work data that is aggregated into actionable information that then is produced in a nice report for management to see and use. And they come in as an input and they go out. You go through these tools and techniques we'll talk about in the next module, and they're shot out the back end as project communications. So whatever it is gets transformed, reports transformed into communications, your main output there. Now maybe these communications aren't exactly what they should have been. The content might have been off. Maybe there's some issues in there because of the communications, but at least you communicated it, and now you're getting feedback. So you talk to your stakeholders. Great, how'd you like this last report? Well, great, except what about this? Okay, now we got an issue, stakeholder issue. So here's the issue log. So now because of the consequence of what you did over here, you need to deal with the issue log here. So those communications right there, and the log, and just incidentally other data comes in here, so you need to control this stuff, and the output would be more information and perhaps change requests to make corrective or preventive actions. So that's an overview of what we're talking about in communications. So communication management plan, project management plan, stakeholder register, these are things that are considered mostly in this context. And efficient communication, now this is really important, and I've said this many times, and here it is now in this particular process. Efficient communication means giving whoever the receiver is only the information they need in order to achieve the project objectives. So don't put fluff out just because you're trying to say, oh, what a great job, look at this, look at this, look at that. Well, I don't care about that. What about this right here? Give them that right there if that's what they want, and don't worry about the fluff. You'll have plenty of time to party and give accolades at the end of the project when you're successful. So here's our data flow diagram. 10.1, here's our project management plan coming in. Certain assets and factors come to bear there, and of course our stakeholder register is key because that's who you're going to communicate with, how, when, and why from the stakeholder point of view. And the output is, the main output is your plan finally that goes into managing. You're going to execute the plan down and manage now, and then over here it will help you manage your stakeholder engagement because you're producing communications the way they want. So that's the whole point of this communication plan. So here's your project management plan as an input, little details. It's, of course, it's always the how-to, the guidance of how the project's executed, monitored, controlled, and closed. We know all that. So now we're talking about monitoring and controlling, basically, controlling. Your stakeholder register, that's your key planning information for communications. Key, not the only one, but it's the key one. Your organizational factors. Here again, PMBOK says, consider everything when you're talking communication, all your culture, your environment. Don't overlook anything so that you hit everything the best way you could. And it says communications have to be adapted to the project environment. If you're out on a job site running the project, you may not have many capabilities to communicate properly. So you need to adapt your communication so that you communicate effectively. Again, effectively means giving the people what they want, what they need to achieve success in that project environment versus maybe in the office where you have more opportunities to communicate that data. And your assets, again, use everything that you have at hand that you can use in your organization, and consider everything before you decide how you're going to communicate, because you need to provide your stakeholder options, right? How would you like this communicated? Do you want a bound book? And you say, well, that would be a little costly. Would a website, internal intranet with this data on it, would that be appropriate for you? Well, that'd be good. Whatever it might be. So, and the most important, again, lessons learned, historical information. How did other people, other project managers do it? Was it successful? Because your project is similar to that one. So rely on these assets. Okay, so now we know what comes in, what's available to us to create our management plan. So let's look at the tools and techniques in a minute. Okay, now we're ready to look at the tools and techniques that are recommended by PMBOK to be able to transform the inputs of the information and all the stuff in communication management plan into that plan. So here we have a rather long list of tools and techniques, and look at what they say. Communication requirements analysis, the communication technology, communication models, communication methods, and of course meetings. A lot of stuff here. Now, the big benefit with PMBOK and their methodology is, regardless of whether or not in the end you use this methodology yourself, the elegance of this methodology is it reveals all these available options that you can consider no matter what you're using. Prince2, comp, project, whatever you're using, or even if it's just your own homegrown methodology, consider all these options that you have available to you, and you may not even realize that the wealth and the breadth of these things that are available to communicate. So let's look at them. Requirements analysis. Again, determine your stakeholders' information needs. Remember on the stakeholder register, there's that spot for communication. You want to start building that up and refining it so that you finally end up with exactly what your stakeholder is expecting from you throughout the project. Determine if the information has value. Again, efficient project communications means only giving the people what they need to know that benefits the project success, and that's the value. Don't give them stuff that'll burden them, cause more questions because they don't understand something that they don't need or don't want to understand. So only give what they need, and that's the value of the information. Communicate only, similarly, what leads to project success. No fluff, right, concise stuff, whatever you really need to help the project proceed, help your stakeholder understand, to help guide them in their conversation, their decisions, and whatever, but only what they need. Don't overwhelm them. Communicate if lack of communication will contribute to failure. Lack of communication will contribute to failure of your project. So remember, 90%, 80-90% of a PM's job is to communicate, a big chunk of that. So don't put your project in jeopardy by failing to pay attention to proper communications, either within your team or with your stakeholders. Limit the potential communication channels, and we're going to see that shortly. But do it in as efficient manner as possible. Limit who communicates with who. Okay, got to keep control of these things, keep it under control. Limit who receives information, right? Now, how many communication channels do you think there are between two people, between you and me? How many communication channels are there? Okay, you want to know? We'll show you. And then between 20 people, I think it's 20? Between you and me, 2, 1, 2, between 20, we don't know. There's a formula. And this came out of a book, back in the 80s or even earlier than that, maybe the 70s, by a fellow named Brooks. He worked for IBM, worked on the System 360. He developed a whole new methodology of doing project management then. And it was called The Mythical Man Month. It's kind of a difficult book, but it's very interesting. But anyway, he came up with this formula. And this is how you determine how complex a communication group is. And it's n times n minus 1 divided by 2. So if we have 6 people over on the left, it's 6 times 5 divided by 2, 15 channels. And here they are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people. A can talk to B, A can talk to E, A can talk to F, A can talk to D and C, and likewise with B and all this stuff. So you add those all up, 15 ways 6 people can speak to each other. That would seem to be starting on the verge of confusion if you don't control it, if you don't have your meeting protocols. Remember, your ground rules, how you communicate in a meeting, is one example of controlling this kind of complexity. Now, what about 20 people? You got 20 people in the room, you can talk about an issue. You got to keep absolute control over that meeting, otherwise what's going to happen? 20 times 19 divided by 2, 190 different channels of conversation could be going on in that room. I talk to you, hey, what do you think? He's talking to this guy. It's just chaos. So this is a really cool formula. You will have to know this formula for your test. Simple formula, n minus 1 divided by 2. But if they ask you, you got 22 people in the room, how many communication channels? Figure it out. That's the answer. But boy, it's exponential. It'd just be nuts. So keep that in mind. Very interesting formula. And think about that when you're in a room with a bunch of people. Watch the dynamics. Say, man, you count them up. There's 8 people in here. There's 26 or 27 different ways these people could talk. But you're the one who's controlling the meeting. You want to talk with them, and they want to talk with you. You got to control all this crosstalk. So it's difficult. Communication technology. What do you have at hand that you could use? Stakeholder information transfer methods. They call it in PMBOK how you're going to transfer information. Urgency of the information is a factor you need to consider, urgency for the stakeholders. The availability of technology for them. Your stakeholders may not be in the room next door or upstairs. They may be in another country. What kind of technology do you use to communicate with them effectively? Or even upstairs, what do you use? You walk up and talk to them. You send them an email. Whatever you have in your communication plan is how you will communicate with that person, and then likewise with all your other stakeholders. Of course, if you have 50 stakeholders, 40 of them may have the same kind of communication methods and plans. You do it all the same way, but the other 10 may have different ones. So you don't know. You got to document it. Got to figure it out with the stakeholder, and only give them what they want, what they need. Ease of use of the technology. If you have some stakeholder that's really iPhone adverse, they say, no, I don't use an iPhone. I don't care. I don't want it. You can't use that with them. You want to try and say, well, we'll give you an iPhone on the project. Now you got to train them on it. And if they really have a mindset for iPhone or whatever, you're not going to be very successful. They'll buck it, they'll object, and it won't be effective. So find another way. The project environment, if you're out in the desert doing some kind of oil drilling thing, you got to have special equipment. About sand in the gearbox, you got to be careful. So that has an impact. And of course, the sensitivity and the confidentiality of the information. This could be as simple as not allowing a certain classification of information to go via fax, where it sits in a fax machine, where anybody can look and say, oh, wow, look at this. Now your confidential information is in the wild. So you got to be careful how you communicate these kind of things. Communication models. Okay, this is basically a very simple communication model. And here are the steps. You got your raw data, your message. You encode it. You transmit it. You send it. You decode it. You get an acknowledgement. Hey, I received it. And by the way, here's my response. That is the basic communication model, and you need to know this. You probably ask some aspect of this in your exam. So here's the deal here. Here's the sender. Here's the receiver. The sender encodes it, transmits it. You may have some noise on the line that may corrupt your signal, may corrupt the results on the other end. So when you decode it, it's garbled. That's always an issue, your noise. And then after you decode it, the receiver sends back an acknowledgement, a noise again if possible, maybe. And the sender says, oh, he received it. Okay. Likewise, now that he's received it and the sender knows it, your receiver then encodes a message back. And this doesn't necessarily mean encrypted. It just means whatever your communication tool is, it wraps it up, and whatever it does, sends it out, encodes it. And so you got a feedback message to say, yes, message, he acknowledged it up here. He says, okay, here's my feedback to your message. And that is the model. That's the loop. And you'll be quizzed on this, some aspect of this, I'm sure, somehow. So the sender's responsibility, let's look at that one more. Okay, the sender over here, receiver over here. The sender's responsibility is to transmit the message, make sure it's clear and concise when they send it, and that he wants to know that there's a confirming message that is understood. Now your receiver's responsibility is to receive the message in its entirety and to acknowledge back and then to respond to it in some manner. That's the model. So know this, that's your basic communication model. Communication methods with stakeholders, it could be interactive, it could be a push or a pull, and what is that? Interactive is two people talking together, a phone, video, whatever, two people interactive. What we're doing here now, you and I in this course right now, I'm doing a push. I'm pushing my information to you, okay? And you, because you called up this video, you're pulling the information to you. That's push-pull. Okay, it's one way or the other, push-pull, if it's not interactive. And those are methods of communicating with your stakeholders. And finally, tools, you have meetings. 3 types of meetings: information exchange, brainstorming, and decision-making. So how are you going to communicate? What methods are you going to use? You want to have information exchange meetings just in the meetings, just do it right there. You can brainstorm information, you can make decisions, and you need a formal agenda when you have meetings like this, and normally you do this when you execute the work. So we're going to talk about the outputs shortly, so we'll be back in a second. Okay, we're back, and where we left off was the outputs from our planning communications inputs and tools and techniques. And remember, there were in tools and techniques, there were a lot of different kinds of communication methods. Here they are just again, so you see them. But the outputs now of doing all that with the inputs and those techniques are the communication plan, the documents in there, how we are going to communicate with who, your stakeholder register and other things. So what's in the communication plan? Your stakeholder is your primary focus in here, how you're going to communicate with them, because you're doing the project for them, maybe for certain of them more than others, but basically you're doing it for your stakeholders. So they're in a communication plan, how you're going to communicate, what you're going to communicate to them, why you're communicating it, because again, you got to have value. Why am I telling you this? And adversely, why am I not telling you something if they ask? Well, that's Don't worry about that. It's here. And then, when are you going to do it and how often? It may differ between your stakeholders. Who does the communicating? Do you do it yourself, project manager? Do you have an admin staff do it? Does maybe a stakeholder wants to know, as somebody's working on a WBS, some work items there, work package, and we'll learn about work packages later. Maybe he wants to know, he's particularly interested in a particular work package, and he says, I want this staff member who's working on the work package to communicate with me every day what he accomplished of those work items. If that's appropriate and you agree, then that's a communication method. That's a requirement. You put that in the stakeholder management plan and in the stakeholder register as an approved communication with that staff member. So who does the communication? Who authorizes, here we are, release of confidential information? Somebody needs to know if you're going to communicate confidential stuff. Let's say you're working on some kind of a, HR database to update their employee payroll records. Well, you don't want payroll, out there, especially if you're a private company. You don't want payroll information out there, people's salaries. But maybe as they're testing, your system, this information, even if it's fake information, you still don't want this to get out and get people talking about stuff. So whatever's confidential, you need to control that, and somebody needs to be responsible for saying, okay, here's the way we're going to communicate that, and no other way, and no fax machines or whatever it might be. So who releases confidential information? Again, what vehicle are you going to use to communicate this information? And you may actually need to do some communication flow charts. It may be complex in your situation, so you may need flow charts. So that's all that stuff is appropriate and should be in your communication management plan, so you know ongoing how to communicate consistently. You're going to have project documents that are updated because of what you finally come up with your communication plan. You may refine your stakeholder register. You may convince or offer different methods of communicating to a stakeholder that says, well, I want it all like this. You say, well, it would be better and more effective for you if we did it this way. And he says, okay, I'll agree to that. Now you got to update the stakeholder register because the communication, how they like it, update it. It's a project document, so it's a viable update to this output of this process. And your project schedule might be impacted because of the way you communicate. Okay, so that's we're at the end of planning communications, rather. So we have our communication plan. We know who, how, when, why, what, all those things are in the plan, and your stakeholder register has been updated. So now we're going to move on to managing and actually executing that communication plan, and then because of the fallout that might happen because of some of that, then we control that under control. So we're going to see that in Module 11.